At my father's black-tie birthday gala, my sister threw her wine in my face and hissed, "You are trash, you do not belong here." Everyone stared like I was nothing. Then the mayor stood up, looked around the room, and said, "You people really do not know who she is?" Silence swallowed the entire ballroom. My sister went pale when the mayor said, "She is the one who..." But before I tell you exactly what the mayor said to freeze my toxic sister in her tracks and completely destroy my family's fake empire, let me ask you something. Have you ever been humiliated by your own flesh and blood in front of a massive crowd? Have you ever had your family treat you like you were invisible, only to drag you into the light just to tear you down? Let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what the weather is like right now. I am genuinely curious to see how far my story travels today. My name is Sloane. I am 31 years old. And the night my sister Blair made the most catastrophic, irreversible mistake of her entire privileged life, she thought she was still dealing with the frightened, people-pleasing little girl I used to be. She was wrong. Dead wrong. It was my father Holden's 70th birthday. The venue was an excessively lavish hotel ballroom in the heart of the city, the kind of place that drips with crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors, and the suffocating scent of expensive perfume mixed with roasted prime rib. There were over 200 people there. We are talking about judges, local politicians, real estate tycoons, and a whole army of high society socialites who only cared about keeping their bank accounts full and their dirty secrets buried. I was standing quietly in a shadowed corner near a massive floral arrangement, trying to blend into the background. I wore a simple, elegant black dress with no jewelry. I did not come to eat their overpriced food. I did not come to celebrate a man who threw me away like yesterday's garbage. I came because of a very specific invitation that arrived at my private office 3 days prior, an invitation that was about to detonate a nuclear bomb on my family's pristine, carefully manufactured reputation. The string quartet was playing a soft, sophisticated jazz melody when Blair finally spotted me. My older sister, 35 years old, wearing a custom red silk gown that probably cost more than my very first car, and sporting a perfectly painted smile that always reminded me of a shark testing the water before a kill. She marched across the ballroom floor, the crowd parting for her like she was royalty. She did not ask why I was there. She did not ask how I had been for the last 7.5 years of total exile. She simply stopped right in front of me, lifted her heavy crystal glass filled with dark Cabernet Sauvignon, and tossed the entire contents straight into my chest and face. The dark red liquid hit my skin with a freezing cold shock. It splashed across my cheeks, stained my neck, and instantly ruined the front of my white silk undershirt and black dress. The sound of the glass sloshing and my sharp intake of breath was so incredibly loud that the nearest guest stopped talking entirely. The string quartet missed a note, the cellist looked over in shock, and the music awkwardly faded into a suffocating, dead silence. "You are trash," Blair hissed. She leaned in so close I could smell the expensive gin on her breath beneath the bitter stench of the wine she just threw. "You do not belong here. You are a stain on this family. Get out before I have security drag you out to the street where you belong." For a long, agonizing second, nobody moved. The silence in that ballroom was so heavy it felt like you could physically choke on it. 200 pairs of wealthy, judgmental eyes were pinned directly on me. I slowly looked over at the head table. My father, the great Holden Sterling, the man being celebrated as a pillar of the community and a beacon of morality, saw exactly what happened. He saw his oldest daughter publicly assault his youngest. And do you know what he did? He slowly turned his head the other way, picked up his sparkling water glass, and took a sip. My mother, Vera, sat right next to him. She nervously adjusted her pearl necklace, her hands shaking slightly, and looked down at her lap, pretending she was suddenly deeply fascinated by the embroidery on her napkin. They were letting it happen, just like they always did. 7 years ago, if this exact scenario had happened, I would have broken down completely. I would have burst into hysterical tears. I would have dug my fingernails so hard into the palms of my hands that they would have bled. I would have run out the back service door, apologizing to the air, suffocating on my own pathetic shame. But I did not cry. I did not shake. I did not even break eye contact with Blair's furious, hateful gaze. I calmly reached into my small black clutch purse, pulled out a thick white tissue, and slowly, deliberately dabbed the red wine off my cheek. I looked at the dark red stain blooming on the white paper. Then I looked back at Blair, who was breathing heavily, waiting for my usual emotional meltdown. I smiled. A very small, very cold, very calculated smile. "Did you actually think I was going to run away this time, Blair?" I asked. My voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried perfectly in the dead, silent room. Her supreme confidence faltered for just a fraction of a second. Her eyes quickly darted around the room, suddenly realizing that my complete lack of a reaction was making her look unhinged and psychotic in front of her wealthy donors. She opened her mouth to scream for the security guards, but the night was no longer under her control. The real reason I was standing in that room was about to unfold. But to understand why Blair hated me enough to publicly attack me, and why my parents allowed it without a second thought, you need to understand the twisted museum of pain they built for me when I was just a ghost haunting their perfect house. Do you want to know what it takes to turn a desperate, loving daughter into a weapon of mass destruction? Growing up in the Sterling household, I was never a daughter. I was an accessory that failed to match the expensive furniture. I was the invisible child, the ultimate scapegoat. If you know anything about toxic family dynamics, you know exactly what I mean. Blair was the golden child. Everything she did was an absolute triumph. If she sneezed, my parents bought her a trophy for having healthy lungs. If I got a perfect score on an advanced math test, my father would barely glance at the paper and ask why my handwriting was not neater. I spent my entire childhood trying to buy their love with blind obedience. I became the ultimate people pleaser. I swallowed my anger, I hid my tears in my pillow at night, and I agreed with every cruel, cutting joke they made at my expense. I thought that if I could just be small enough, quiet enough, and helpful enough, they would eventually notice me and love me. Let me give you a quick tour of my personal museum of pain. Exhibit 1. When I was 12 years old, I spent 3 agonizing weeks painting a beautiful, incredibly detailed landscape for a statewide school art competition. I poured my soul into it. I won first place. I proudly brought the canvas home and placed it on the living room mantel, hoping my mother would finally be proud of me. The next morning, it was gone. I searched the entire house in a panic. I finally found it shoved deep into the oily garage trash can, the canvas violently ripped in half. Blair had thrown it away because, in her own words, it was taking up the space where she wanted to display her new participation ribbon from a local, amateur dance recital. When I went crying to my mother, she told me to stop being so dramatic, stop acting like a victim, and to respect my sister's achievements. Exhibit 2. My college graduation. I worked 3 separate minimum wage jobs to pay my way through a public state university because my father flatly refused to pay a single dollar for a business degree he deemed utterly useless. On the day I finally walked across that stage to get my diploma, looking out into the massive audience, my specific section of seats was completely empty. Not one single person from my family showed up. Not my parents, not my aunts, not my sister. Why? Because it was the exact same day Blair decided to host a soft opening for her new luxury day spa, a vanity business my father fully funded with hundreds of thousands of dollars. They could not spare 1 hour for my graduation, but they spent 10 hours drinking expensive champagne at a spa that eventually went completely bankrupt 6 months later. But those were just warm-ups. Exhibit 3 is where the real, terrifying villainy of Blair Sterling truly shines. This is the first massive twist in the knife she buried in my back. When I was 23 years old, I honestly thought I had finally found my escape route. I was engaged to a man named Preston. He was a junior corporate lawyer, very handsome, incredibly charming, and for the first time in my miserable life, he made me feel like I actually mattered. We were planning a small, quiet wedding, something simple, far away from my family's suffocating, toxic influence. I was happy. Truly, deeply happy. Blair could not stand it. She did not want Preston. She did not even like his personality. She thought he was boring and poor. But he belonged to me. And in Blair's twisted, deeply narcissistic brain, I was not allowed to have anything that she did not have first. If I was happy, it meant she was losing. 3 weeks before my wedding day, I went to Preston's apartment to surprise him with a homemade lunch. His front door was unlocked. I walked in, carrying a brown paper bag, and immediately heard strange noises coming from the master bedroom. I froze in the hallway. The sound of my sister's distinct, high-pitched, mocking laugh echoed down the corridor. I stood there, feeling my entire world disintegrate into ash. I pushed the bedroom door open just enough to see them. I did not scream. I did not cry. I just turned around, walked out, and threw the lunch into the dumpster outside. Later that night, I confronted Preston. He broke down crying like a pathetic child, giving me some disgusting excuse about how Blair had relentlessly pursued him, manipulating his emotions when he was stressed about work. He admitted she had been sending him highly explicit texts for 6 months, cornering him at family events, wearing him down until he finally made a mistake. He begged for my forgiveness on his hands and knees. I took off my engagement ring, threw it as hard as I could at his chest, and walked out of his life. When I confronted Blair in our parents' massive marble kitchen the very next day, she did not even flinch. She just took a slow sip of her iced coffee, looked me up and down like I was a piece of garbage, and laughed. If he really loved you, Sloane, he would not have even looked at me. Consider it a massive favor. I saved you from marrying a weak man. You should be thanking me. I turned to my parents, waiting for them to finally, just this once, defend me. To see how evil she was. My father sighed heavily, rubbed his temples, and looked at me with pure, unfiltered annoyance. Sloane, please, he said. Do not make a massive scene and ruin the family reputation over a stupid boy. Preston was not a good fit for you anyway. You are too emotional. Let it go. We have a major charity gala to plan for this weekend, and I will not have you two bickering like little children. They did not care that my heart was completely shattered. They only cared about how it would look if the wedding cancellation made the local social gossip columns. That was the exact day I realized my family was not just blind to her abuse. They were actively participating in my destruction. But the betrayal with Preston was only the beginning of the nightmare. What I discovered a few months later proved that Blair was not just a cruel, jealous sister. She was a full-blown criminal. After the wedding fell apart, I was deeply depressed, barely eating, and struggling to find a reason to get out of bed. But I still needed a job to survive. My father, in a rare moment of what I foolishly thought was pity, offered me a basic, unpaid internship at Sterling Horizon Rehab. It was a massive chain of high-end rehabilitation centers my family owned, heavily funded by our family's charitable trust, which supposedly helped low-income patients get premium medical care. Blair was the chief operating officer. I was basically her glorified, unpaid assistant, doing all the miserable grunt work she absolutely hated. I filed thousands of papers, organized complex schedules, and brought her iced lattes. But being the invisible sister has one major advantage. People completely forget you are in the room, and they leave their highly sensitive documents lying around. One rainy afternoon, I was walking down the hallway of our flagship clinic when I saw Blair shooting a promotional video for the upcoming winter charity drive. She was standing next to Mrs. Gable, an 82-year-old woman who was slowly recovering from a severe stroke. Mrs. Gable was incredibly fragile, shaking, and clearly exhausted from standing under the hot studio lights. "Action," the cameraman said. Blair instantly put on her brightest, most sickeningly sweet smile and hugged the frail old woman tight. "We care about every single precious life here at Sterling Horizon," Blair said directly to the camera, her voice dripping with fake empathy. But Mrs. Gable lost her balance, stumbled slightly, and coughed, ruining the perfect shot. Blair's glowing smile vanished instantly. Her face turned into a mask of pure rage. She grabbed the old woman's frail arm entirely too hard. "Can you just stand still for 2 damn minutes?" Blair snapped, her voice dropping into a vicious, hateful growl. "We are trying to raise money to pay for your miserable, pathetic existence, so do not ruin my take again. Look at the camera and try to look grateful." I watched Mrs. Gable's cloudy eyes fill with humiliated, silent tears. It made my stomach turn completely upside down. I stepped forward to intervene, but Blair waved angrily to the camera crew to start rolling again, instantly snapping back to her fake, glowing, angelic persona. That night, my blood was boiling. I stayed late at the office, supposedly to organize some vendor files in Blair's massive office. I was looking for a specific catering contract when I found a hidden, unmarked folder buried at the very bottom of her locked filing cabinet. The drawer was slightly jammed, and I had managed to pull it open with a letter opener. Inside were hundreds of pages of highly complex financial records that absolutely did not match the official public ledgers I had been filing all month. I am naturally brilliant with numbers. It was my only real talent. As I read through the dense documents, the puzzle pieces snapped into a horrifying, crystal-clear picture. Blair was signing off on massive, multi-million-dollar payouts from the charity trust, supposedly for patient subsidies, new medical equipment, and facility repairs. But the money was never going to the clinic. It was being systematically wired to a series of shady consulting firms and anonymous shell companies. I cross-referenced the names of the consulting firms using my phone. One of them, Apex Business Solutions, had a corporate address listed in a neighboring state. I looked it up on satellite maps. The address belonged to a completely empty, abandoned warehouse. I dug deeper into the public registry. The owner of the LLC was registered under a proxy, but the emergency contact listed on the state business registry was a phone number I knew by heart. It was Preston's personal cell phone number. My ex-fiancé. That was the moment I realized the true depth of her sickness. She did not just steal my fiancé to hurt my feelings. She stole him because he was a dirty, morally bankrupt corporate lawyer who was perfectly willing to help her launder millions of dollars stolen from sick, vulnerable, dying people. I gathered copies of the most damning documents, shoved them into my bag, and marched straight into my father's massive corner office the very next morning. I slapped the thick folder onto his polished mahogany desk. I was shaking with pure adrenaline and righteous anger. "Dad, you need to look at this right now," I demanded. "Blair is siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars from the charity trust into fake companies. She is working with Preston. It is massive corporate fraud, Dad. If the authorities find out, the whole family will go to federal prison. We have to stop her." My father slowly put on his reading glasses, opened the folder, and glanced at the first 2 pages. His face did not change. He did not look shocked. He did not look angry. He calmly closed the folder, slid it into his deep desk drawer, and locked it with a small brass key. Then he looked up at me with eyes so cold they could freeze boiling water. "You listen to me very carefully, Sloane," he said, keeping his voice dangerously low and steady. "Your sister is the public face of this entire company. She is securing major political donations next week that will double our net worth. Do you really, honestly think I am going to let your pathetic, jealous, hysterical vendetta ruin her career?" I stared at him, my mouth falling open in sheer horror. "You knew?" I whispered, my voice breaking. "You know she is stealing money from dying people?" "I know exactly how the real business world works," he snapped viciously. "Something you clearly do not understand. Blair is managing complex financial tax strategies. You are an emotionally unstable, deeply jealous little girl who is still bitter about a broken engagement. If you ever speak a single word of this to anyone, I will personally ruin you. I will make sure no one in this entire state ever hires you. I will bury you. Do you understand me?" He chose her. He chose the lie. He chose the dirty money. I walked out of his office feeling like I was suffocating, realizing my entire family was a criminal syndicate. But they were not done destroying me. They needed a foolproof way to guarantee my absolute silence permanently, and fate handed them the perfect weapon just a few weeks later. After the horrifying confrontation with my father, my life completely spiraled out of control. I was depressed, isolated, and completely cut off emotionally from the people who were supposed to protect me. In a moment of absolute weakness, extreme loneliness, and a desperate need for any kind of human validation, I went to a local dive bar and had a brief, meaningless fling with a guy named Jackson, someone I barely knew from my college days. It was a stupid, reckless mistake made by a completely broken girl trying to feel something other than crushing emotional pain. A month later, I stood staring at a cheap plastic stick in a cramped, dirty gas station bathroom. 2 pink lines. I was pregnant. When I tracked Jackson down and told him the news, his face went completely white. He panicked. He immediately blocked my phone number, quit his part-time job at a local diner, and literally moved out of the state within 3 days. I was utterly alone, carrying a child, with absolutely no money, no job, and no support system. I had no choice but to tell my parents. I foolishly thought, maybe, just maybe, the news of a grandchild would soften their hardened hearts. I thought the innocence of a baby would make them help me figure my life out. I stood in the grand foyer of our massive family estate, my hands shaking violently as I confessed to my parents that I was pregnant. Blair was standing halfway up the grand sweeping staircase, casually sipping a green detox smoothie. My mother gasped loudly and covered her mouth in exaggerated horror. My father's face turned a shade of violent purple I had never seen before. A bastard child? My father roared, his deep voice echoing aggressively off the cold marble floors. You are an absolute, disgusting disgrace. You sleep around like a cheap tramp and bring this filthy shame into my house? I am scared, Dad, I cried, hot tears streaming down my face. I need help. Just for a little while. Blair walked slowly down the stairs, her expensive heels clicking sharply like a metronome of doom. You do not need help, Sloane. You need to be permanently institutionalized. You have been acting completely crazy ever since Preston dumped you. Making up psychotic lies about my bank accounts, and now this? You're sick in the head. That is exactly when the family PR machine kicked into high gear. Within 48 hours, my father had systematically spread a vicious rumor through our entire wealthy social circle that I had suffered a severe mental breakdown. They painted me as a delusional, highly unstable, dangerous girl who needed to be kept away from normal society for her own good. It was the absolute perfect cover-up. If the crazy, bitter, pregnant sister ever tried to whistleblow to the police about the missing charity funds, literally no one would believe a single word she said. My father handed me 2 black plastic garbage bags, told me to pack my cheap clothes, and physically pushed me out the heavy oak front door into the freezing November wind. He immediately canceled my credit cards, shut off my phone plan, and told the estate gate guard to call the police if I ever tried to step foot on the property again. I had exactly $200 in my checking account. I spent the very first night sleeping in the cramped back seat of my beat-up Honda Civic in a brightly lit Walmart parking lot. It was so incredibly cold I could clearly see my own breath filling the car. I wrapped myself in all the coats I owned, holding my stomach, crying so hard until I literally vomited outside the car door. The next morning, desperate, starving, and absolutely terrified for the tiny baby growing inside me, I walked to a dirty payphone outside a gas station. I used my last few quarters to call my mother's private cell phone. I thought that as a mother herself, she could not possibly let her pregnant daughter freeze to death in a car. Mom, please, I begged, my teeth chattering uncontrollably. I am so cold. I have not eaten anything since yesterday morning. Just wire me $500. Please. Just enough for a cheap, safe motel room for 1 week, so I can find a waitressing job. Please, Mom. Do not let your grandchild freeze. There was a long, agonizing pause on the other end of the line. I heard her sigh heavily. Sloane, you did this to yourself, my mother said. Her voice was dripping with fake, sickening sympathy. Your father has frozen all the bank accounts. I do not have access to any money right now. My hands are completely tied. You need to learn a hard lesson about consequences. I am so sorry, but I absolutely cannot help you. She hung up on me. The dial tone sounded exactly like a flat line on a hospital monitor. I believed her. I really, truly did. I believed my mother was just a helpless, abused victim of my father's controlling, dominant nature. I survived that brutal winter by going to crowded women's shelters, eating canned tomato soup from local food pantries, and cleaning filthy motel rooms for cash under the table. It was absolute hell on earth. But here is the second massive twist of the story, the one that finally killed the last ounce of human love I had for my mother. Years later, when I finally gained legal access to the family's financial records, I saw the official bank statements from that exact day. The day I called her crying from a freezing payphone. The day she told me she had no money and her hands were tied. On that exact same afternoon, just 2 hours after she hung up the phone on her freezing, desperate, pregnant daughter, my mother signed a massive personal check for $200,000. Who did she give it to? She gave it to Blair. It was a luxury down payment for a massive summer vacation villa in the Hamptons. She literally let me sleep in a freezing car so her golden child could have a second vacation home. That was the exact night the weak, pathetic, people-pleasing Sloane died forever. The woman who woke up the next morning did not want their love anymore. She wanted pure, unadulterated justice. They say hitting rock bottom is a solid foundation to build a completely new life upon. They're absolutely right. I officially changed my legal name, completely dropping the toxic Sterling surname and taking my mother's maiden name, Miller. I became Sloane Miller. I worked exhausting night shifts at a greasy diner to pay for a tiny apartment rent, and during the day, I studied like my life depended on it, because it actually did. When my beautiful, perfect daughter, Harper, was born, holding her tiny, fragile hand in that sterile, fluorescent-lit charity hospital room, I made a silent, unbreakable vow. I would never, ever let anyone make us feel small again. I used my natural, intense talent for complex numbers to get a full scholarship, earned my advanced certifications in risk analysis and forensic accounting, and started consulting for small local businesses. I was completely relentless. I worked 80-hour weeks. I was brilliant at finding hidden financial leaks and exposing corporate fraud. Within 5 years, I had built my very own firm, Miller & Associates. We quickly became one of the most ruthless, feared, and respected risk analysis firms in the entire state. I was making millions of dollars, but I lived incredibly quietly. No flashy sports cars, no magazine covers, no high society parties. I stayed completely off the radar. The Sterling family thought I was probably dead in a ditch or permanently locked in an insane asylum. They had absolutely no idea a massive apex predator was growing in the shadows. When I landed my first massive corporate consulting contract, I took $1,500,000 of my own hard-earned money and quietly created a blind trust called the Dawn Foundation. I anonymously used that money to fully pay back all the low-income patients and desperate families that Blair's charity scam had robbed. I did it because it was the morally right thing to do, and because I knew that keeping the IRS away from the victims was the very first step in building a flawless, inescapable trap for my sister. Then, one rainy Tuesday afternoon, a man confidently walked into my private office. His name was Declan. He was a notorious independent investigative journalist with a fierce reputation for totally destroying corrupt politicians and dirty CEOs. He dropped a thick, unmarked manila folder right onto my desk. I have been closely tracking a massive money laundering ring connected directly to Sterling Horizon Rehab, Declan said, sitting casually in my leather chair. My inside sources say you are the absolute best forensic accountant in the state, Ms. Miller. Or should I say, Ms. Sterling? I did not flinch. I slowly opened the folder. It was all there. Blair's fake invoices, the offshore shell companies, the deep rot running through my family's entire empire. Why bring this information to me? I asked him, keeping my face perfectly neutral. Because you are the only person alive who knows exactly how they operate from the inside, Declan replied, leaning forward. And because I found something else in the county clerk's deep, restricted archives. Something your father paid a very expensive, very corrupt lawyer to bury 7.5 years ago. He slid a single, yellowed, officially stamped document across the desk. I looked at it, and my breath violently caught in my throat. It was the third massive twist in this nightmare. It was my late grandfather's true, completely unaltered last will and testament. My grandfather was a harsh, unforgiving man, but he was incredibly sharp. He built the entire family fortune from nothing. He died when I was 22, just before everything in my life fell apart. At the time, my father told everyone that grandfather had left the entire estate and controlling shares of the foundation strictly to him, skipping the grandchildren entirely. That was a disgusting lie. I stared at the bold signature on the page. My grandfather had seen right through Blair's toxic narcissism and my father's blinding arrogance. He knew they would absolutely ruin the legacy. The real will stated clearly that upon his death, 60% of the family's total wealth and the majority voting power in the foundation was to be placed in an irrevocable trust solely in my name. 60%. I was the majority shareholder. I was the rightful owner of the entire empire. My father and Blair had illegally bribed the family attorney to seal this true version of the will and enforce an older, revoked version. That was the real, terrifying reason they were so incredibly desperate to kick me out, label me crazy, and completely ruin my public credibility. It was not just about hiding the charity fraud. If I had stayed in that house, if I had hired a competent lawyer, I would have eventually discovered the truth. They threw a terrified, pregnant girl onto the freezing streets to violently steal her legal inheritance. A cold, terrifying calm washed over my entire body. I looked up at Declan. "You want to expose them to the public?" I asked. "I want to win the Pulitzer Prize," he smiled sharply. "You want cold-blooded revenge. We make a very good team." I shook my head slowly. "I do not want revenge, Declan. Revenge is messy, loud, and emotional. I want a complete, devastating audit." For the next 6 long months, Declan and I worked in absolute, paranoid secrecy. We obsessively traced every single dollar Blair had stolen. The deeper we dug into the servers, the more thoroughly disgusting it became. But it was not until we finally hacked into the offshore registry associated with the shell companies that I found the fourth twist. The one that made my blood run absolutely ice cold and made me want to destroy her. We were sitting in my dark office at 2 a.m, eating cold pizza, staring intensely at a decrypted offshore bank ledger on my glowing monitor. "Look closely at the ownership names on these 3 specific accounts," Declan said, pointing at the screen with his pen, his face pale. I leaned in. The accounts currently holding the stolen millions from the charity trust were not registered to Blair Sterling. They were not registered to Preston. They were legally registered to Sloane Sterling. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. I quickly pulled up the digitized corporate incorporation documents. There it was. My signature. Or rather, a perfectly, flawlessly forged copy of my signature, used to open illegal offshore accounts and sign off on highly fraudulent tax returns. Blair was not just stealing money to buy expensive shoes. She had spent the last 7 years meticulously building a massive paper trail that completely framed me for every single federal crime she committed. Her plan was evil genius. If the IRS or the FBI ever finally raided the foundation, Blair would cry fake, hysterical tears and hand over the documents showing that her mentally unstable, estranged, runaway sister had secretly orchestrated the entire fraud before disappearing. She planned to let me take the ultimate fall. She planned to send me to federal prison for decades while she sat in her Hamptons villa, sipping margaritas and playing the victim. She did not just want me gone. She wanted me buried alive in a concrete cell. "We have more than enough evidence to go straight to the FBI right now," Declan said, looking at me with deep concern. "We can have her arrested and in handcuffs by tomorrow morning." "No," I said, my voice dangerously steady. "Handing her to the police in the middle of the night is far too easy. She operates in the dark. I want to forcefully pull her into the blinding light. I want to take away the absolute only thing she actually cares about. Her wealthy audience." 2 weeks later, a thick, expensive cream-colored envelope arrived at my office. It was formally addressed to Sloan Miller, CEO of Miller & Associates. Inside was an exclusive VIP invitation to the 70-year birthday gala for Holden Sterling. The event was being publicly billed as a massive charity fundraiser. Blair and my father had absolutely no idea that Sloan Miller, the highly successful, mysterious forensic accountant they had been actively inviting to corporate mixers to secure her firm's financial backing, was actually the daughter they violently threw away. Declan had used his deep political connections to ensure my firm was added to the absolute top of the VIP guest list, seated right next to Mayor Cassidy, a powerful woman famously known for her absolute zero-tolerance policy on corporate corruption. I bought a simple, beautiful, incredibly expensive black dress. I hired a trusted babysitter for Harper. I put the original will, the forged signatures, and the real bank ledgers onto a heavily encrypted silver flash drive. I was walking directly into the lion's den, but I was not the helpless prey anymore. I was the hunter. Which brings us right back to the suffocating ballroom. To the freezing wine dripping off my chin. To my sister glaring at me with pure hatred, waiting for me to finally break. To the silence stretching so tight it felt like the crystal glasses on the tables were going to violently shatter. Blair sneered at my calm reaction. "Who let this trash in here?" she yelled, looking frantically at the security guards standing by the grand double doors. "Remove her immediately. She is mentally ill. She is trespassing." The guards started walking quickly toward me. My father looked immensely relieved. My mother looked away. Blair smiled her shark smile, truly thinking she had won again. That is when the loud, sharp sound of a chair violently scraping against the marble floor echoed through the room like a gunshot. Mayor Cassidy stood up. She was a tall, imposing woman who commanded absolute, unquestionable authority. She did not look at the approaching guards. She looked directly at Blair. "Stop right there," the mayor commanded. Her voice was like a heavy whip cracking in the silent room. The security guards froze instantly. Blair blinked, her fake smile faltering in confusion. "Madam Mayor, I apologize for the interruption," Blair stammered, frantically putting on her sweet, professional, PR-approved voice. "This is just a deeply troubled family member who needs psychiatric help. We will handle it quietly." Mayor Cassidy took a slow, deliberate step away from her table. She looked around the entire room, making direct eye contact with the wealthiest, most powerful people in the city. "You people really do not know who she is, do you?" the mayor asked, her tone laced with absolute raw disgust. Blair's face lost all its color. She went completely pale, looking like she had just seen a ghost. "What are you talking about?" Blair asked, her voice shaking slightly. Silence swallowed the entire ballroom. "She is the one who saved you," the mayor said, turning to point directly at me. If you are enjoying this story so far and want to see exactly how Sloane destroys her toxic family's empire in front of everyone, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below with the name of the city you are living in. Every single comment helps this video reach more people who might need to hear this message. Thank you so much for your support. Now, let's get back to the fireworks. "She is the one who saved you," the mayor said, her powerful voice echoing off the high, painted ceilings of the ballroom. She pointed a manicured finger directly at me. The entire room seemed to stop breathing. 200 of the most powerful people in the city were frozen in their expensive chairs, their champagne glasses hovering halfway to their mouths. I stood there, the dark red wine still dripping slowly onto the marble floor from my ruined dress, but I did not feel humiliated anymore. I felt like a judge preparing to deliver a final, devastating sentence. Blair's face contorted into a bizarre mixture of absolute confusion and pure, unadulterated panic. Her eyes darted wildly between me and Mayor Cassidy. "Madam Mayor," Blair stammered, her voice suddenly losing all of its arrogant venom. "I think there has been a terrible misunderstanding. This is my estranged sister Sloane. She is deeply unwell. She is unemployed, she is broke, and she has a long history of making up insane, dramatic lies for attention. Please do not let her ruin my father's beautiful night." Before the mayor could even respond, my Aunt Margot practically leaped out of her chair at the family table. Aunt Margot was the ultimate flying monkey, a woman who had spent her entire miserable life kissing my father's shoes just to stay in his good graces. She scurried over to me, grabbing my elbow with her sharp, bony fingers. Sloane, have some self-respect and go home right now, Aunt Margot hissed in my ear, trying to physically pull me toward the exit. You are embarrassing the family. You are upsetting your father. Just walk away before things get worse for you. I did not move. I slowly turned my head, looked down at her claw-like hand gripping my arm, and gave her a look so completely devoid of emotion that she instantly let go and took a step back, visibly shaking. No one is going anywhere, Margot, Mayor Cassidy announced, stepping forward into the center of the room. And there is absolutely no misunderstanding here. Your lovely chief operating officer just threw wine in the face of the single most important benefactor this foundation has ever had. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. My father, Holden, slowly stood up from the head table. His face was gray. The confident, untouchable billionaire act was rapidly crumbling. Mayor Cassidy, what exactly are you implying? He asked, his voice trembling for the first time in his entire life. I am not implying anything, Holden, the mayor said sharply. I am stating a certified fact. Last year, when your charity trust was quietly drowning in a massive deficit and facing a catastrophic class action lawsuit from the low-income families your clinics allegedly served, a completely anonymous trust called the Dawn Foundation stepped in. They wired $1,500,000 to cover your mysterious financial shortfalls and compensate the victims. That money saved your foundation from being completely shut down by the state. It saved you from a federal investigation. The mayor turned and looked directly into Blair's terrified eyes. And the sole founder, funder, and director of the Dawn Foundation is standing right in front of you, covered in your wine. Her name is Sloane Miller. The silence that followed was so profound it was actually deafening. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning unit. You could hear the ice melting in the water glasses. Everyone was staring at me. The broke, crazy, outcast daughter was the secret millionaire savior of the Sterling Empire. Blair literally stumbled backward, her high heels catching on the carpet. No, she whispered, shaking her head violently. No, that is impossible. That is a lie. She does not have a dime to her name. She lived in her car. She is a pathetic nobody. I finally spoke. My voice was calm, measured, and completely merciless. I was a nobody, Blair, I said, looking right through her. Until you threw me away. Then I had to become somebody else. But my sister was a malignant narcissist, and narcissists do not surrender when they are cornered. They double down. They attack. And Blair was about to play what she thought was her ultimate, unbeatable trump card, completely unaware that she was walking right into the most humiliating trap I had ever set. Blair straightened her posture, desperately trying to regain her footing. She smoothed down the front of her expensive red silk gown and plastered on a fake, condescending smile that looked more like a grimace. She turned her back to me and addressed the entire ballroom, raising her hands as if she were a preacher calming a confused flock. Ladies and gentlemen, please, Blair projected her voice, dripping with forced confidence. I do not know how my sister managed to trick the mayor's office with fake documents about this supposed Dawn Foundation, but it is clearly an elaborate, psychotic stunt. My sister has been obsessed with ruining me for 7 years. She turned to look at the mayor, her eyes flashing with desperate arrogance. Madam Mayor, you are being completely manipulated by a very sick woman, Blair stated firmly. My foundation has absolutely nothing to hide. In fact, our financial transparency is unmatched in this entire state. Just last week, we underwent a totally voluntary, rigorous financial audit. And we did not use just anybody. We hired the most ruthless, brilliant risk analysis firm on the East Coast. We paid them $150,000 to go through every single penny we have. Blair looked over at my father, who was nodding slowly, clinging to this life raft of a lie. Miller and Associates, Blair announced loudly, making sure the investors in the room heard the prestigious name. Miller and Associates conducted our audit. And they gave us a completely flawless, perfect financial bill of health. Our books are pristine. So whatever insane lies my sister is trying to sell you tonight, they are completely disproven by the best accountants in the business. A murmur of relief washed over the wealthy donors in the room. They knew the name Miller and Associates. It was a gold standard. If that firm said the charity was clean, then it was clean. They started looking at me with pity again, assuming I really was just a crazy, jealous sister making a desperate scene. I let the murmur swell. I let Blair bask in her temporary, pathetic victory. I let her feel safe for exactly 10 seconds. Then, I reached into my small black clutch purse again. I did not pull out a tissue this time. I pulled out a sleek, matte black business card. I took 2 steps forward, closing the distance between me and my sister. I raised my hand and casually flicked the business card into the air. It fluttered down and landed perfectly on the pristine white tablecloth of the nearest VIP table, right next to Blair's empty wine glass. "Read it," I commanded. My voice was not loud, but it cut through the room like a razor blade. Blair looked down at the card. She hesitated. Her hands were shaking. She slowly picked it up, holding it between her perfectly manicured fingers. She stared at the silver-embossed lettering on the black card. I watched her eyes track back and forth as she read the words. I watched her soul leave her body. Her jaw literally dropped open. Her eyes widened so much I thought they would pop out of her skull. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking like a terrified corpse. She tried to speak, but only a dry, choking sound came out of her throat. "What does it say, Blair?" I asked, taking another step closer, forcing her to look at me. "Read it to the room. Read it to the mayor. Read it to your precious investors." She could not speak. The paper was trembling violently in her hand. So I read it for her. "Sloan Miller," I announced to the dead silent ballroom. "Chief Executive Officer and Senior Managing Partner. Miller and Associates." Someone in the back of the room let out a loud, shocked gasp. My father collapsed back into his chair as if he had been physically punched in the chest. My mother covered her face with both hands and started sobbing. I smiled at my sister, a genuine, terrifying smile. "Thank you, Blair," I said sweetly. "Thank you for paying my firm $150,000 of your own money to grant us full, unrestricted, legal access to all of your private ledgers, your hidden hard drives, and your offshore accounts. My junior partners really enjoyed their time in your office. You were right about one thing. Miller and Associates is the most ruthless firm on the East Coast. And we found absolutely everything." Blair was hyperventilating. "You cannot do this," she wheezed, clutching her chest. "That is a conflict of interest. That is illegal. It is completely legal when you sign a binding contract that waives your right to privacy," I replied calmly. "And it is completely legal when the CEO of the firm is acting as an authorized whistleblower for the federal government. You brought the Trojan horse right into your own castle, Blair. You paid me to build your coffin." But I was not done. The trap was sprung, but the final, deadly blow was still coming. Because uncovering the charity fraud was just the appetizer. Exposing her sick, twisted plan to frame me for her crimes was the main course. And I had brought the receipts. The atmosphere in the ballroom had shifted from shocked silence to absolute, chaotic panic. The wealthy donors were realizing that they were sitting in the middle of a massive federal crime scene. People were pulling out their expensive smartphones, furiously texting their lawyers and financial advisors, scrambling to distance themselves from the Sterling family name before the news broke. Blair was completely cornered. Her perfect reputation was burning to ashes right in front of her eyes. But she was a Sterling. And a Sterling never admits defeat until there is literally no other option. I reached into my purse for the third and final time. I pulled out a small, heavy, silver flash drive and held it up between my fingers so the entire room could see it catching the light of the chandeliers. "On this tiny piece of metal," I announced, my voice ringing with absolute authority, "is the complete, unedited truth. It contains the real, original last will and testament of my grandfather, which my father and sister illegally suppressed to steal my 60% majority ownership of this entire empire." My father let out a pathetic, whimpering groan and buried his face in his hands. "It also contains," I continued, taking a step toward Blair, "the IP addresses, the wire transfer logs, and the forged signature documents proving that my sister deliberately opened offshore shell companies in my name. She did not just steal millions of dollars from dying patients. She spent 7 years meticulously framing me for it. Her plan was to let me go to federal prison for the rest of my life if she ever got caught. The disgust in the room was palpable. Mayor Cassidy looked at Blair like she was looking at a repulsive insect. Blair's eyes locked onto the silver flash drive. She realized that tiny piece of metal was the only thing standing between her and a 10-year prison sentence. Her survival instincts kicked in, overriding any sense of logic or decorum. She lunged at me. She literally lunged like a wild animal, her perfectly manicured hands clawing at my face. But I was ready. I sidestepped her clumsy attack, but as I did, Aunt Margot rushed me from the other side. Margot slammed her shoulder into me, knocking me slightly off balance. The flash drive slipped from my fingers and hit the carpet. Margot dove for it with a speed I did not know the old woman possessed. She snatched the silver drive off the floor, her eyes wide with desperate madness. "No one hurts this family." Margot screamed at the top of her lungs, completely unhinged. "No one destroys the Sterlings." Before anyone could stop her, Margot turned and sprinted toward the massive, 20-tier crystal champagne tower that dominated the center of the buffet tables. With a hysterical shriek, she threw the silver flash drive directly into the center of the tower. It was absolute chaos. The drive hit the top tier, shattering 3 crystal glasses instantly. The impact compromised the entire structure. With a deafening, catastrophic crash, the entire 20-tier tower collapsed. Thousands of shards of expensive crystal and gallons of sticky champagne rained down onto the marble floor, completely burying the flash drive in a sparkling, ruined mess of glass and liquid. The room erupted into screams. People jumped back to avoid the flying glass. Blair stood panting, staring at the destroyed champagne tower. She looked at the wreckage, and then she looked at me. Slowly, a deranged, triumphant smile spread across her face. She started laughing. It was a horrible, grating, psychotic sound. "It is gone." Blair laughed, pointing at the wet, glittering pile of broken glass. "The evidence is gone, you stupid girl. It is ruined. It is completely waterlogged and smashed. You have nothing. You cannot prove anything without the original files. I win. I always win." She actually thought she had beaten me. She thought she had found a miraculous escape route at the very last second. I stood there, surrounded by screaming socialites, looking at my sister's unhinged, victorious face. I did not panic. I did not scream. I just let out a soft, genuine sigh, raised an eyebrow, and casually brushed a speck of dust off my ruined black dress. "Blair," I said, my voice dripping with intense, overwhelming pity. "Did you really, honestly think that one of the top forensic risk analysts in the country would walk into a room full of known thieves and liars holding the only original copy of the evidence?" Her horrible laughter cut off instantly. The deranged smile froze on her face. "What?" she whispered. I shrugged. "That was a blank decoy drive I bought for $6 at a gas station on my way here tonight. I brought it specifically because I knew your predictable, violent narcissistic rage would make you try to physically destroy it. I needed everyone in this room, especially the mayor, to see you actively attempt to destroy evidence." I tapped my wristwatch. The actual, heavily encrypted data files were entirely automated, I explained slowly, watching her world finally, permanently collapse. They were programmed to automatically send to the personal servers of the district attorney, the FBI white-collar crime division, and the IRS exactly 15 minutes ago. I paused, letting the absolute terror wash over her. "Listen," I said softly. The entire ballroom went dead silent again. And then, cutting through the quiet night air outside the hotel, we all heard it. The distinct, high-pitched wail of police sirens. And they were getting louder and louder and closer. "They are already pulling up to the front lobby, Blair," I smiled. "The show is over." The sound of the approaching police sirens was the ultimate catalyst for the complete and total destruction of the Sterling family unit. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom burst open, and several hotel security guards rushed in, looking panicked, yelling that federal agents were aggressively locking down the building. The wealthy donors and politicians did not wait around to offer their support. It was like watching a sinking ship full of rats. The investors shoved past each other, trampling over expensive floral arrangements, pulling out their phones to cancel their massive donation checks and furiously dial their crisis management teams. No one wanted to be caught in the same room as a federal raid. Within minutes, the glittering, suffocating empire my father had built on lies and intimidation was reduced to a panicked, screaming mob running for the emergency exits. But the most beautiful, poetic justice of the entire night was watching the so-called loyal Sterling family completely turn on each other like starved wolves. As the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers began illuminating the sheer curtains of the ballroom windows, my father snapped. He realized that his legacy, his billions, and his freedom were all evaporating in real time. He marched over to Blair, his face twisted with a rage I had only ever seen directed at me. "You stupid, arrogant, careless idiot," my father roared at Blair. He raised his hand and slapped her across the face so hard the sharp sound echoed over the chaos. Blair stumbled backward, clutching her red, stinging cheek. She looked at the man who had worshipped her for 35 years with pure shock. "You ruined everything," Holden screamed, spraying spit in her face. "I covered up your pathetic little embezzlement scheme to protect the company, and you were sloppy enough to let this miserable outcast trace the money? You framed her? You left a paper trail? You are going to take the fall for this entirely, Blair. I will tell the feds I knew absolutely nothing." But Blair was not a loyal soldier. She was a selfish parasite. The moment she realized her beloved father was throwing her under the bus to save his own skin, she viciously bit back. "You think you can pin this all on me, you cowardly old man?" Blair shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria. "I did not bribe the lawyer. You did. You were the one who hired the thugs to intimidate grandfather's attorney into burying the real will. You committed felony fraud to steal Sloane's inheritance before I even touched a dime of the charity money. I have the audio recordings of your meetings, Dad. I recorded everything. If I am going to a federal cell, I am dragging you right down to hell with me." They were screaming at each other, tearing each other apart, completely oblivious to the fact that I was standing right there watching them self-destruct. There was no loyalty. There was no family bond. There was only greed, and the terrifying realization that they were finally going to face the consequences of their actions. Then I felt a weak, trembling hand grab my wrist. It was my mother, Vera. Her expensive makeup was completely ruined, running down her face in dark black streaks. She looked 10 years older than she had just an hour ago. She fell to her knees right in front of me, crying hysterically, grabbing the fabric of my ruined black dress. "Sloane, please." My mother sobbed, her voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "Please, my baby girl. You have to stop this. You have to tell the mayor you made a mistake. Tell them it was all a misunderstanding. Please, Sloane. They are going to take the house. They are going to put your father in prison. He will die in there. I will have nothing. You cannot do this to your own family." I looked down at the woman who had birthed me. I looked at her manicured hands gripping my dress, begging me for mercy. I did not feel angry anymore. I did not feel sad. I just felt completely, utterly empty. I gently but firmly pried her trembling fingers off my dress. I stepped back, looking down at her kneeling in the spilled wine and broken crystal. "You made your choice 7 years ago, Mom," I said, my voice incredibly soft, yet completely immovable. "When I called you from that freezing payphone, begging for a motel room so your grandchild would not freeze to death in a car, you told me your hands were tied. And then you bought a villa in the Hamptons." Her eyes widened in horror. She realized I knew everything. She realized she had no leverage left. "You do not have a daughter anymore, Vera," I told her. "You sold me for a vacation house. Enjoy the absolute nothing you have left." I turned my back on her sobbing form and walked toward the small stage at the front of the room. The federal agents in dark windbreakers were actively storming through the doors now, shouting orders, holding up warrants. But I had one last thing to do before I left this toxic nightmare behind forever. I walked up the short steps to the elevated stage. The microphone that was supposed to be used for my father's grand, self-congratulatory birthday speech was still sitting on the podium, switched on and ready. I stepped up to the microphone. I looked out over the massive, chaotic ballroom. Federal agents were actively separating my screaming sister and my sweating, panicked father. Aunt Margot was sitting on the floor, weeping into her hands. The remaining guests who had not managed to escape were standing against the walls, watching the empire collapse in real time. I tapped the microphone. The sharp thump echoed through the massive speakers, cutting through the yelling and the chaos. Everyone, including the federal agents, paused and looked up at me. I stood tall. I did not try to hide the massive, dark red wine stain covering my chest. I wore it like a badge of absolute honor. It was the physical proof of their cruelty and the undeniable symbol of my survival. My name is Sloan Miller. I spoke into the microphone, my voice steady, powerful, and completely unbroken. And I want to make one thing perfectly clear to everyone in this room before I leave. I looked directly at my father, who was being aggressively handcuffed by two large agents. I did not come here tonight because I wanted applause. I did not come here because I wanted your money or your pathetic, conditional love. I came here because incredibly vulnerable people with far less power than anyone in this room were being actively harmed, and the people who were supposed to protect them hoped they would just stay quiet and die in the dark. I shifted my gaze to Blair, who was crying uncontrollably as an agent read her Miranda rights. I spent my entire childhood being told to make myself smaller so my sister could shine. I spent my life being told that my truth was an inconvenience to this family's perfect image. Tonight, my sister threw a glass of wine in my face and told me that I was trash and that I did not belong here. I took a deep breath, feeling the crushing weight of the last 31 years finally lifting off my shoulders. She was absolutely right, I said, a genuine smile breaking across my face. I do not belong in a room where love is a transaction and cruelty is a business strategy. I do not belong at a table where victims are silenced to protect the egos of monsters. I do not belong in this family. I looked at all of them one last time. The broken champagne tower. The crying mother. The handcuffed billionaires. I am returning your spotlight, I concluded softly. I hope you enjoy it in the dark. I turned off the microphone. I walked down the steps of the stage, bypassing the federal agents who nodded at me with quiet respect. I did not look back. I walked straight through the heavy oak double doors of the ballroom, through the grand hotel lobby, and pushed through the revolving glass doors into the cool, crisp night air. The city was quiet outside. The flashing police lights painted the street in a rhythmic red and blue glow, but I barely noticed them. I took a massive, deep breath of the freezing air. It tasted like absolute, pure freedom. I pulled out my phone and looked at the lock screen. It was a picture of my beautiful daughter, Harper, smiling with paint smeared on her nose. I am coming home, baby, I whispered to the screen. I walked down the street, my high heels clicking against the concrete, leaving the sterling legacy to burn to the ground behind me. I did not need to stay to watch the ashes fall. I had a beautiful, peaceful life waiting for me, and for the first time ever, it was entirely mine. It has been exactly 6 months since the night of the gala. The fallout was more massive and destructive than even I had anticipated. The local news cycle talked about nothing else for weeks. Blair's pathetic attempts to negotiate a plea deal completely failed. Because I had handed the prosecutors a flawlessly encrypted, undeniably proven paper trail of wire fraud, identity theft, and severe charity embezzlement, she had no leverage. 2 weeks ago, she was officially sentenced to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. The judge specifically noted her complete lack of remorse and her terrifying attempt to frame her pregnant, estranged sister for her crimes. There are no silk gowns or expensive gin in federal prison. My father did not fare much better. The scandal triggered an immediate mass exodus of investors and partners. The Sterling Horizon rehab empire completely collapsed under the weight of the federal investigations. The IRS seized almost every single asset to pay off the massive tax fraud penalties. My father was forced to declare total, humiliating bankruptcy. The immense stress of losing his precious public reputation caused him to suffer a massive stroke. He survived, but he is currently living in a mediocre, state-funded nursing facility. The irony is not lost on me. As for my mother, Vera, she was not criminally charged, but she was left with absolutely nothing. No mansions, no Hamptons villa, no country club memberships. She moved into a tiny, cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city. Last week, my phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number, but I instantly recognized the desperate, whining tone. Sloan, it is Mom. Please. I am so lonely. Your father is sick and Blair is gone. I know I made mistakes, but I am still your mother. I am still Harper's grandmother. Family is family. Please let me come over and see my granddaughter. I just want to hold her. Please forgive me. I sat in the beautiful, sunlit living room of my new home. I watched my 7-year-old daughter, Harper, laughing loudly as she aggressively painted a massive blue ocean on a large canvas we had set up in the corner. She was safe. She was deeply loved. She was completely unaware of the toxic darkness I had fought so hard to keep away from her. I looked back down at the text message from the woman who had let me freeze in a car to buy a vacation house. I felt a brief, microscopic flicker of pity, but it was instantly extinguished by the fierce, protective instinct of a real mother. Forgiveness is a beautiful concept, but it does not require giving toxic people access to your peace. Healing does not mean you have to open the door for the monsters who tried to break you. I did not type a reply. I simply pressed the block button, deleted the message, and put my phone face down on the table. I walked over, picked up a paintbrush, and helped my daughter paint a bright yellow sun in her blue sky. Winning was never about destroying them. Winning was about realizing that I never needed them in the first place. I built my own empire, my own family, and my own absolute happiness out of the broken pieces they threw away. But I want to turn this over to you, because I know there are people watching this who have been told that they have to forgive their abusers just because they share the same blood. Many people in the online comments have told me that I was too incredibly harsh on my mother at the end, that she was just a weak, brainwashed victim of my father and sister, and that I should have let her see her granddaughter because she has nothing left. What do you think? Is the silent enabler just as guilty as the person holding the knife? Was I completely wrong to permanently shut the door on my own mother, or was I right to protect my daughter's peace at all costs? Let me know your honest opinion down in the comments. I read every single one of them. Thank you so much for watching, listening, and sharing this journey with me. If you have ever been the invisible child, remember that your silence is not a weakness. It is just the quiet before you roar. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more stories of surviving the unimaginable. Protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.